Hey there, stretch out. Close your eyes if you'd like. We're not galloping into battle tonight. We're doing something even harder. We're ruling an empire, a real one. One with broken roads, silent monasteries, too many suns, and not enough quill ink. And right at the center of it all, a man named Charlemagne, who spoke like a soldier, but thought like a saint, and never quite figured out how to hold a pen. This isn't the Rome of marble columns and togas. This is the Frankish Empire. Wooden halls that smell like smoke. Iron crowns that dig into your forehead. Sleepy towns waking up to Latin prayers and royal tax collectors. It's half miracle, half mess, and somehow Charlemagne keeps it going, so get comfortable. Let the noise of the day fade out. Let the distant church bells chime softly in the dark. You don't need to remember the dates. You don't need to study the maps. Just imagine cold mornings in Aachen, a heavy cloak, a heavier crown. And one man is trying to convince an entire continent not to fall apart. Because empires don't run on force alone, they run on memory. And Charlemagne remembered everything except how to spell his name. The emperor who couldn't write his own name. Let's start with the weirdest thing about Charlemagne. He couldn't write. Now, to be fair, this wasn't entirely his fault. This was the 8th century, and pens were made from quills. Ink was messy, and writing desks were any flat surface that didn't have crumbs or candle wax on it. Most kings didn't write. They dictated. They had scribes. They had monks who copied things slowly while muttering about grammar in Latin. But Charlemagne, he really tried. He wanted to. He even kept wax tablets under his pillow so he could practice tracing letters before bed like a royal toddler. Imagine that the most powerful man in Western Europe hunched over in the candlelight, poking at wax with a stylus, frowning like a student trying to remember how to spell king. His empire stretched from the Atlantic to the Danube. He ruled over hundreds of thousands of people, and yet when it came to a signature, he handed the pen to someone else. But make no mistake, he wasn't dumb. Charlemagne had what you'd call book hunger. He loved learning, surrounded himself with scholars like Alcuin of York, who looked like a grumpy librarian and acted like a medieval Google. Charlemagne made schools. He ordered people to read. He told bishops to start writing down laws instead of just yelling them across fields. He believed that an empire needed books just as much as it required swords. But when it came to actually writing something down, he just couldn't get his hands to cooperate. It's not that he didn't try. It's just that his fingers were better suited for holding swords than scribbling psalms. Some historians think it embarrassed him. Others say he saw no need, since he had people to do it for him. But deep down, something is endearing about the idea that this towering, bearded conqueror, who'd burned towns, crowned popes, and named laws after himself, still struggled with cursive. He may not have written the empire into existence, but he read it into shape. Every scroll, every gospel, every report from the provinces. He listened. He remembered. He repeated things back in ways that made people squirm. So no, Charlemagne couldn't write his name, but he sure knew what it meant. And in the end, that might have mattered more, because even if he couldn't sign the law, he was still the law. Waking up in Aachen, he never really slept in. Charlemagne woke early, usually before the sun had decided what kind of day it wanted to be. Not because he loved mornings, but because empires didn't pause for groggy emperors. The palace in Aachen was cold in the mornings, even in summer. Stone didn't care about seasons. The floors were chilled, the halls echoed like empty cathedrals, and the first sound of the day was often someone coughing in Latin. He'd rise from his bed layered with furs and linen, surrounded by the faint smell of sweat, incense, and something vaguely goat-like. His feet hit the floor with a thud that startled a servant into motion. There was always someone standing in the corner, half awake, holding a cloak, a cup, or a piece of news that wasn't quite ready to be delivered yet. The emperor stretched, not majestically, just like a man whose joints were beginning to sound like saddle leather. Then he prayed quietly, as if he were trying to remind heaven who was boss without actually saying it aloud. Breakfast came quickly, not elegant. Warm bread, a bit of cheese, something boiled. There was always something boiled. He didn't linger. While most people were still yawning into their sleeves, Charlemagne was already getting briefed by someone named Fulrad or Bernhard or Sigibert, who had ridden through rain and fog to announce that some minor count had stolen a bishop's horse and declared himself king of 4 rocks and a cabbage field. Charlemagne didn't lose his temper often, but when he did, it was never loud, just a silence, a stare. The kind of silence that made the messenger stammer and the room colder. Sometimes, instead of answering, he'd walk out to the courtyard where a line of people were already waiting. Nobles, priests, foreigners with important haircuts. They'd bow, he'd nod, no throne, no ceremony, just a big man in a fur cloak who listened better than he spoke. And every morning, after the updates and the grievances and the awkward Latin, he'd walk the grounds of the palace school, just watch the children read aloud. He couldn't write, but he made sure they could. Alcuin would be there, lecturing about grammar like it was a holy relic. Charlemagne would linger, nodding at lessons he couldn't teach, but paid for anyway. Sometimes he'd stop, sit with them, listen, ask questions. Not emperor questions, kid questions. Why does that letter look like a fish? Who decided Latin should have 5 different words for beakers? Why does everyone keep sneezing? And then before the sun was even high enough to cast a proper shadow, he was off again to the chapel, to the stables, to the war room, to the quiet corner where he kept maps nobody else could read. He'd scratch his beard, he'd grunt, and he'd start running the empire all over again. Because in Aachen, morning didn't bring peace. It brought problems. And Charlemagne was wide awake. The royal wardrobe, yes, there were fur leggings by mid-morning. Charlemagne was already 3 decisions deep into a tax dispute, and halfway through a boiled onion when someone reminded him he still wasn't wearing pants. Not just any pants, royal pants. And in this empire, what you wore mattered almost as much as what you said. Because if you showed up to a council in sheepskin and smelled like fish, people stopped listening. Unless you were the emperor, then they kept listening and just held their breath. Charlemagne had a thing for clothes. Not velvet or lace, not silks from the south. He preferred the practical heavy cloaks, soft tunics. Wool that still smelled faintly like the sheep that donated it. He liked fur too, thick, matted, slightly suspicious fur that made him look less like a ruler and more like a bear who'd wandered into church by accident. He wore leggings when it was cold. Real fur leggings, the kind that whispered conqueror and itchy in the same breath. The servants dressed him in layers. Undershirt, tunic, cloak, sword, belt. Sometimes, during official ceremonies, they'd try to get him into a gold-threaded robe. He'd wear it for 15 minutes, then ditch it in the hallway like a toddler refusing church clothes. Comfort came first. Fashion never came. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was trying to stay warm. Aachen had wind that crept through cracks like gossip, his crown. Heavy, too heavy. He only wore it when the Pope showed up or when someone needed reminding. The rest of the time it sat on a shelf collecting dust and occasional resentment. Shoes were another story. He hated fancy ones, preferred leather boots, sturdy, quiet. Good for walking and stomping. You couldn't run an empire in sandals. Not unless you wanted blisters and an uprising in Saxony. And still, despite all this, people continued to gift him clothes. Foreign leaders sent capes, turbans, and silk gloves. Charlemagne would nod politely, then hand them to a servant who would either store them or accidentally use them to mop the floor. One time, he received a jeweled cloak from Constantinople. He wore it once. It caught fire when he leaned too close to a candle during Mass. He didn't flinch, just kept singing the hymn while someone patted out the flames with a hymn book. Because in the end, Charlemagne's wardrobe wasn't about looking royal, it was about feeling ready, ready to pray, ready to fight, ready to tell 3 arguing nobles that none of them were getting what they wanted. So yes, he had fur leggings. And yes, they were probably ridiculous. But when you rule half of Europe and can't write your name, you wear what keeps you standing. And besides, if anyone laughed, they didn't laugh long. How he ruled so much without Google Maps? There were no maps. Not really. Not the kind that helped. Not the kind that said, turn left after the goat farm. And if you reach the monastery with the burnt roof, you've gone too far. Charlemagne ruled lands that stretched over mountains, rivers, angry forests, and people who sometimes forgot they were ruled at all. He didn't have GPS, he had guesses. And men on horseback, most of his empire existed in memory and prayer. Local lords swore loyalty. Monks wrote it down. Messengers carried messages from Aachen to places with names longer than a sermon. But half the time they returned with mud on their boots and a shrug. The road was flooded, they'd say, or bandits took the horse. Sometimes the report just said, area unknown, possibly cursed. Charlemagne didn't panic. He just nodded, stared at the fireplace for a while, then assigned someone else to ride out and figure out what happened to the last guy. He had a network. People who weren't quite spies, weren't quite governors, but hovered somewhere in between. They carried scrolls and attitude. They showed up in villages with orders, questions, and the kind of face that said, please don't stab me, I work for the emperor. He called them his missi dominici. Everyone else called them a problem. They'd show up unexpectedly, sit in on court cases, question the taxman, then vanish into the woods. Some said they were ghosts. Others said they were angels. Most just hid their sheep until they left. And through this web of riders, reports, and rumors, Charlemagne kept track of everything. Sort of. It wasn't perfect. Sometimes he heard about rebellions 2 months later. Once he discovered that a whole town had disappeared, and nobody had noticed for a year. But he didn't need perfection. He needed movement. Orders are flowing in, answers are flowing out, a heartbeat. Even if the pulse came from a man riding through the Alps with 3 fingers and a memory full of poorly pronounced Latin, he didn't chase every problem. Some he let simmer, some he fixed by writing laws and hoping that someone somewhere would enforce them. At other times, he would pack up his saddle and go to look for the issue himself, because nothing solved a dispute like the emperor showing up on horseback, smelling like boiled meat and divine authority. Still, the empire was always half mapped, half heard, half understood, but somehow he ruled it anyway. With instinct, with information gathered slowly, like rain dripping into a cracked bucket. He read letters in the bath. He questioned messengers about meat. He remembered names no one else cared about. Charlemagne didn't need a map. He had people. He had questions. And most of all, he had time. Because when you're running half of Europe, you don't need to know where everything is. You just need to make sure everyone knows who you are. Church and crown. A cozy little power couple, Charlemagne didn't just rule land. He ruled Sundays, he ruled prayers. He ruled the parts of people's lives they whispered about in candlelight when the rain hit the roof just right. And for that, he needed the church not just because it held power, but also because it owned vast amounts of land. But because in the 8th century, if you wanted people to kneel and listen, you gave them a cross before a crown. He and the church had a thing. Not always smooth, not always holy, but deeply, stubbornly intertwined. He built churches like a man building watchtowers. He paid monks, he corrected bishops, he made sure the scriptures were being copied correctly, even if he couldn't quite read every line himself. His relationship with God was personal, political, and strategic. Because if you were going to convince a bunch of warlords to obey a man wearing fur leggings and a ring, you needed more than soldiers. You needed faith with structure. Charlemagne spent a considerable amount of time in church. Not just for appearances, he liked the silence. The echo, the slow drip of wax down iron candelabras. Sometimes he prayed, sometimes he planned. Sometimes he would just listen to the organ and think about which border was falling apart that week. Priests respected him mostly, but some found him a bit too curious. He'd interrupt sermons to ask questions. He once had a bishop repeat a line about charity 3 times because he liked the way it sounded. He corrected homilies with the confidence of a man who couldn't read but remembered everything. The Pope was another story. They got along. Mostly there were letters, gifts, moments of tension. One winter, the Pope sent Charlemagne a special robe stitched in gold. Charlemagne wore it once and gave it to a visiting abbot who needed a blanket. The Pope was not thrilled. And then there was the coronation. Christmas Day, Rome, big crowd, incense in the air, and everyone holding their breath. The Pope stepped forward and placed a crown on Charlemagne's head. Emperor just like that. Some say it was a surprise. Others say Charlemagne saw it coming, but pretended not to. Either way, it worked. Suddenly he wasn't just king of the Franks. He was something bigger, something holy. A new Caesar for a new age. But here's the twist. That crown didn't make things easier. It made them heavier. Now he had to balance thrones and theology, border skirmishes and Bible verses, one hand on his sword, one hand on a hymn book still. He made it work, mostly because even when the bishops argued, the monks mumbled, and the Pope got dramatic, Charlemagne stayed grounded. Not in doctrine, in instinct. In the quiet knowledge that ruling souls was messier than ruling land, and that sometimes if you wanted peace across a continent, you had to kneel first, just long enough for someone else to place a crown on your head. Taxation and tithes, or how to politely rob people, Charlemagne didn't knock on your door and ask for coins. That would have been too direct. Instead, he built a system. It had layers, Latin, men with scrolls, people who seemed to be always cold and angry at the same time. And through this slow-moving machine of obligation, taxes happened. You didn't know where they went, you just knew they went. You gave your grain, you gave your sheep. Sometimes you gave the third best ox, so the first and second could keep pulling your cart. That was called generosity or survival. The empire was enormous, and big things are hungry. Armies needed shoes, roads needed gravel, monks needed ink. Somewhere someone had to pay for the cathedral with the roof that kept falling in. That someone was everyone. Charlemagne didn't collect the money himself. He had men for that. Local lords with heavy rings and suspicious ledgers. They rode around, smiled without warmth, and left with your barley. If you were lucky, they left you enough to survive the winter. If not, you lit a candle and hoped next year would be kinder. But it wasn't just about taxes. There were tithes, holy taxes, God's share. 1/10 of everything whispered into the arms of the church. Wheat, honey, the occasional goat. The church wrote it down. The emperor nodded, and the peasants sighed. You didn't question the tithe, you questioned your luck. You wondered if the bishop really needed that much wine. Charlemagne watched it all from Aachen. He read the reports. He asked questions no one wanted to answer. Like, Why does a village that used to have 4 barns now only have 1? Or why 3 chickens arrived in tribute when there were clearly 5 on the original list? He wasn't cruel, but he wasn't clueless either. When something didn't add up, someone usually went missing, quietly. And yet, even as taxes drained the countryside, something strange happened. People kept farming, kept building, and continued to show up for mass. They grumbled, they shared crusts. They named their sons after saints and their daughters after luck. And in the middle of all that, the empire moved forward. Slowly, stubbornly, with one hand in your pocket and the other blessing your children. Because Charlemagne didn't act like a tyrant. He was like a father with too many children. You didn't always love him, but you understood. The empire was a house, a creaky, drafty house, and someone had to keep the roof from falling in. Even if that meant giving up your last loaf so a man in fur could build a school in a town you'd never see. And if you ever doubted it was worth it, well, you just had to say so once. Then someone else would be paying your taxes for you. The misty dominici were watching you. It started with a knock, or not even that. Just hooves in the distance, dust on the horizon, and then 2 men appeared. Cloaks, crosses, scrolls, not soldiers, not saints, something in between. They didn't speak much. They asked questions, wrote things down, slept in the corner of your hall and stared at your bread like it owed them answers. These were Charlemagne's eyes, the misty dominici, his trusted messengers, inspectors, watchdogs with clean fingernails and dangerous memory. They didn't come to fight. They came to notice who was paying taxes, who wasn't, who built a church, who tore one down. One man said they could smell dishonesty like smoke. Another swore one of them could recite laws backward just to make you nervous. They carried parchment, seals. The emperor's voice stretched over miles of mud and suspicion. No one liked it when they showed up. Not the lords, not the priests, not the guy who swore he had paid his tithe, but somehow also had a new wine cellar. The missi didn't accuse. They just looked, nodded, made a mark on a page and moved on. But afterward, things changed. The roads got repaired. Widows got their land back. A church roof was fixed overnight. Sometimes a corrupt official disappeared. Sometimes he didn't. Sometimes he just started behaving a little too well and smiling a little too widely. Charlemagne didn't need to be everywhere. He just needed everyone to believe he could be. The missi helped with that. They didn't knock down doors. They didn't shout, but they made people sweat, even the ones who had nothing to hide, because no one really trusted their own innocence. Not when the questions came so calmly. And here's the strange part. Sometimes the missi lied, or got things wrong, or were bribed by someone with too much bread and not enough shame. But Charlemagne forgave the mistake, not kindly, just quietly, because the real power wasn't in the reports, it was in the watching. The reminder that even in the middle of nowhere, someone might be listening. They didn't stay long, never more than a few weeks. They left behind scuffed floors and nervous glances, and once they were gone, people walked straighter, spoke softer, held prayers a few seconds longer, just in case the emperor still had ears on the walls. Because he probably did, or not. That was the beauty of it. The empire didn't run on fear. It ran on awareness that somewhere out there beyond the horizon, someone was still writing things down. In Latin, in silence, in ink that stained the truth so intensely. No one dared forget it. Royal feasts, stale bread, and intestinal regret Charlemagne liked to eat. Not in the indulgent, grapes fed to you by servants. More like a tired soldier who never quite unlearned the habit of devouring food like it might be taken away mid-bite. His feasts weren't spectacles. They were strategy sessions with spoons. You didn't get invited for fun. You got invited because something needed fixing. And if you were chewing while the emperor asked a question, you learned quickly to swallow first and think later. The menu was not luxurious. Bread, always bread, sometimes soft, mostly hard, occasionally apologizing for being bread at all. Meat too. Boiled if you were lucky, charred if the cook had been drinking, pork, goat, and the occasional deer. If someone in the palace had gotten brave with a bow and soup, endless bowls of warm, beige confusion ladled into whatever vessel was closest, even if it had just held ink. Charlemagne wasn't picky, but he noticed. If the meat was undercooked, he raised an eyebrow. If it was overcooked, he raised the cook's anxiety. But he never wasted food. Not because he was humble, because he was practical. He'd grown up during lean times. Times when a bowl of broth was the difference between ruling and fainting in front of the entire court. The guests at his table were an odd bunch. Monks who chewed slowly and whispered in Latin. Nobles who didn't quite know where to put their hands. Visiting kings who tried too hard to laugh. Charlemagne sat in the middle, cutting meat with a knife that had likely also been used in battle, occasionally nodding at someone who mistook it for approval and immediately dropped their spoon. And still, despite the awkward silences and the sound of too much chewing, essential things got done. Borders got redrawn over roast duck. Marriage alliances were sealed with soggy cake. Someone once confessed to tax fraud while elbow deep in lentils. Charlemagne didn't even flinch, just took another bite and motioned for a scribe. The only real problem with the royal feasts was what happened after, because no one had discussed digestion. No one warned the newcomers. There was something about the combination of old cheese, heavy meat, and prayer that turned even the bravest stomachs into diplomatic emergencies. One ambassador from Lombardy spent 3 days in the latrine muttering psalms and regretting stew. Charlemagne, he barely blinked. His stomach was steel. Years of questionable campfire cuisine had made him immune to it. He ate, he spoke, he ruled, and then he walked it off like indigestion was for lesser kings. So if you found yourself dining with the emperor, you smiled, you swallowed, and you prayed to survive both the conversation and the cuisine. Because under all the bread and boiled mystery, you weren't just eating dinner, you were digesting policy. One cramp at a time. The palace school, where the king was also a student, Charlemagne never really trusted stillness. If a room were quiet for too long, he'd ask someone a question. If a monk paused before answering, he'd ask another. His mind didn't rest, even when his legs did. So somewhere between wars, prayers, and bread, that tasted like punishment, he built a school. Right in the middle of his palace. A royal classroom with walls that smelled like wax and parchment, where children recited Latin and grown men forgot how to pronounce things they thought they knew. It wasn't a regular school. There was no bell, no blackboard, no recess. There were no exams, unless you counted trying to explain grammar to a king, who refused to stop asking why every Latin noun needed a gender. Charlemagne sat among the students, not above them, not behind a curtain. Right there, elbows on the desk, eyebrows furrowed, a bearded emperor leaning in too close to a monk named Alcuin, who corrected him with the patience of a man who'd prayed for precisely this, then regretted it immediately. Charlemagne asked questions like a boy with something to prove. He was curious, relentless. Sometimes proud, occasionally wrong. One time, he tried to spell Holy Roman Empire and ended up inventing 3 new letters by accident. Alcuin didn't laugh. No one did. Not because they feared him, but because it was clear he genuinely wanted to learn. Even when he mispronounced Augustine so severely that it sounded like a sneeze. He believed that knowledge wasn't just for monks, it was for everyone. He made nobles send their sons to school. He ordered priests to learn how to read the texts they were preaching from accurately. If you held power, you had to open a book, or at least stare at one convincingly while someone else turned the pages. The school wasn't quiet. It hummed with murmurs, quills scratching, and Alcuins sighing in 3 languages. Scrolls lay half-rolled on tables that shook when someone sneezed. Children chanted verses while servants tried to mop ink spills that looked suspiciously like swearing. Charlemagne never became a great writer. His hands refused, but his ears were sharp. He absorbed ideas like he absorbed land quickly, thoroughly, sometimes too much at once. And though his fingers stumbled, his memory didn't. He quoted Aristotle before breakfast. He argued theology over dinner. He corrected nobles mid-sentence with words he couldn't spell, but remembered hearing last Thursday during a lecture on St. Jerome. The twist wasn't that the emperor built a school. It was that he refused to stand outside it. He stepped in, he sat down, and he learned loudly, clumsily, earnestly. The most powerful man in Europe was scratching Latin into wax, as if it might save him, because in a way it already had. How to conquer people and make them love you, Charlemagne, didn't knock on your gates yelling threats. He knocked them down, walked in, and started asking where the nearest church was. He didn't just conquer, he converted. And once he had your land, he got to work on your soul. Not with tenderness, not always with fire and steel, but with an odd combination of force, flattery, and freshly copied scriptures that somehow smelled like both hope and deadline. After a battle, he didn't vanish. He built things, churches, roads, bathhouses. Occasionally he brought laws, he brought monks who looked at your festivals and gently suggested less dancing and more psalms. He brought structure, and for a lot of people that was better than chaos, because Charlemagne didn't just want to win, he wanted to be remembered. He gave new leaders titles that sounded impressive in Latin, even if they held little meaning. He allowed locals to retain their customs, until those customs involved pagan rituals or spitting on bishops. Then he'd pause, smile, and send in a very polite army, one that carried both crosses and torches. The strange part was how often it worked. People didn't always resist. Some towns surrendered before the first arrow flew, not because they feared him, though they usually did, but because the word had spread that the big man with the beard and the iron crown didn't just destroy things, he improved them. He listened. He asked questions. And then he made decisions that somehow felt like they'd already been decided for you. Charlemagne would walk through a conquered village like he was inspecting his own backyard. He'd speak with elders, bless children, quote, scripture with just enough effort that people believed he knew what he was saying. And then he'd leave behind a priest, a tax collector, and a list of rules that sounded like they'd always been there. But the twist wasn't in how he took power, it was in how he stayed in it. He didn't vanish behind palace doors. He showed up, rode into trouble spots, Saturday through lengthy disputes about livestock and water rights. He made himself present, tangible. A myth wrapped in wool who might appear on your doorstep tomorrow, asking why your grain taxes were late. That's what made people follow him, not just the battles, not just the buildings, but the possibility that he knew your name, that the man who ruled most of Europe might actually remember the argument your village had with its neighbor 3 winters ago, because sometimes he did, and that made all the difference. He didn't need statues. He had memory. He didn't need loyalty. He built it. One chapel, one rule book, one bread-crusted dinner at a time. Diplomacy with ducks and swords, Charlemagne didn't always solve problems with battles. Sometimes he solved them with birds. Not metaphors, real birds. Fat ducks from the Frankish countryside, tied up and packed in baskets, sent off with silk and wine to some distant court, with a name that sounded like a sneeze. He believed in gifts, not because he was generous, because he was practical. Swords made people flinch. presence made them pause. He sent embassies east and west, to kings, to caliphs, to people who spoke languages no one in Aachen could pronounce without straining a lip. The envoys carried letters written in very polite Latin and wore expressions that said, "Please don't kill the messenger. He's just trying to remember which hand to bow with." The most famous one came back with an elephant. An actual elephant walked all the way from Baghdad. No one quite knew what to feed it. Someone tried apples, someone else offered cheese. Eventually, they just let it graze near the chapel and hoped God understood. Diplomacy wasn't a performance. It was a long game of don't blink. Charlemagne would send gifts wrapped in meaning. A sword wasn't just a weapon, it was a reminder. A robe wasn't just fabric, it was a suggestion. And sometimes, when he really wanted to make a point, he sent books. Heavy ones, with gold leaf and prayers inside. Not because he thought the other king would read them, but because he wanted them to know he did. Meetings with other rulers were rare. Most happened through messengers with dry mouths and aching saddles. When they did meet, the greetings were awkward. Too many bows, too many titles. One time, a visiting prince knelt the wrong way and had to pretend he was tying his shoe, even though he wasn't wearing any. But it worked. Mostly, wars were delayed, alliances were made, peace was bought with poetry and salted pork. Even the Pope received a gift once, a beautifully carved chest filled with relics, and the vague suggestion to stay in Rome and stop writing so many dramatic letters. The twist wasn't the elephant, or the ducks, or the messengers who got lost and came back 6 months late with beards and new accents. The twist was that Charlemagne understood the quiet power of gestures. He didn't just conquer with armies, he conquered with expectation. A gift meant you mattered. A reply meant you understood. And so the empire grew. Not just by the sword, but by the slow, deliberate passing of packages across dusty borders, wrapped in cloth, smelling like incense with perhaps a hint of fear. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing Charlemagne ever sent was a smile folded inside a letter, signed by someone else, and carried by a man with dust in his teeth and a duck under his arm. Life for the regular peasant, mostly cold and muddy, while Charlemagne sent ducks to caliphs and elephants to the Pope. Most of his empire was too busy trying not to freeze to notice. Far from Aachen, far from the polished stone and boiled meat. Life looked different, slower, wetter, more confused about whether the mud was a road or just a permanent condition. The people who lived in this empire, the ones without titles or Latin tutors, spent most days elbow deep in dirt, hoping their one goat didn't die before spring. There were no gold crowns here, just wool hats that never quite dried. No scribes, just neighbors who repeated things until they became tradition. They paid taxes in grain, in eggs, in silence. Sometimes they didn't even know who ruled them. They just knew that once a year someone arrived to count their chickens and mutter about tithes. That meant the emperor still remembered they existed. Probably most peasants never saw Charlemagne. They heard of him, the way you hear about storms before they arrive. Stories passed around the firelight that he was tall. He rode everywhere. That he spoke in sermons and listened as if God was waiting for his reaction. Some swore he once healed a blind monk with bread. Others said he had a sword that could talk. Either way, they hoped he stayed far away, because when power visited, it usually meant someone got conscripted or their field got trampled by a noble's significant horse. The peasant house was one room, straw roof, dirt floor, one fire in the middle, and one blanket for everyone. In winter, you didn't sleep. You shivered until you passed out. In summer, you hoped your crops survived long enough to keep you from selling your shoes. Education came in the form of weather predictions made by someone's uncle and warnings carved into fence posts by people who didn't survive last year's harvest. And yet, in the strange way only empires can allow, things still worked. The roads were bad, but they led somewhere. The laws were vague, but mostly ignored. The church showed up often enough to remind everyone that sin was real and heaven was uphill. Children grew, bread baked. Life crawled forward, one splinter at a time. And once, just once, a man swore the emperor rode through his village. No fanfare, no guards, just a bearded rider who paused to look at a half-collapsed church roof and then rode on. He didn't speak, he didn't stay. But 2 weeks later, builders arrived with timber and nails. No one asked questions, they just started working. Because in the empire of Charlemagne, even if the emperor forgot your name, the wind still carried his. And if it was strong enough, it might fix your roof. Or remind you who was king of all this cold, muddy, beautiful mess, laws, oaths, and why everything was in Latin. Charlemagne loved order. Not the loud kind with punishments and shouting, but the quiet kind that came from everyone pretending they understood the same rules. His empire wasn't built on fear alone. It was built on parchment. Parchment that crinkled when you touched it and smelled like dust and judgment. The laws were written in Latin because of course they were, even though most of the people hearing them didn't speak Latin, and the ones reading them usually fell asleep halfway through the second clause. He passed laws about everything: fences, baptisms, bread. If it could be named, it could be ordered. And once it was ordered, it was sacred. Not because it was perfect, but because it bore his name, or at least someone else's handwriting pretending to be his. Oaths were the glue, sworn by men with dirt under their nails and swords at their sides. You swore loyalty to the king, to your lord, to the bishop, who couldn't remember your name but remembered your debts. The words were heavy, spoken slowly, like they were afraid of falling over. The trick was memory. People didn't carry the laws around. They brought them in stories. That one village where a man stole a loaf and got sent to build roads for 10 years. That noble who lied under oath and found his estate suddenly full of monks doing inventory. The laws didn't have to be read. They had to be remembered, whispered, repeated, woven into the rhythm of the day so deeply you forgot where the rule ended, and the habit began. And yet, despite all this structure, things still went wrong. Land disputes, disputes over cows, disputes over who insulted whose cousin in front of the wrong saint's shrine. Charlemagne didn't handle every problem, but when he did, he listened like the outcome mattered. Then he spoke like it didn't. His judgment was fast, not always fair. But finally, and that finality was a kind of peace, people didn't question at least, not twice. But the real twist, the quiet curve hidden behind all the scrolls and declarations, was this. Charlemagne didn't write the laws to control people. He wrote them so people would stop asking him questions. A road rule here, a tithe adjustment there. He was building a manual, one that meant the empire could run while he was asleep or at war, or sitting in the bath trying to remember how to conjugate a verb. The laws weren't perfect, neither was the empire. But together they worked, just enough. And so the parchments kept coming, carried by riders who looked exhausted before they even reached the village square. Read aloud by priests who pronounced half the words wrong. Sworn to by people who didn't understand every rule but understood this much. When Charlemagne made a law, it didn't matter if it made sense. It only mattered that you followed it. Charlemagne's kids, mistresses and inheritance, nightmares the empire looked tidy on a map. Boundaries, laws, oaths, Latin. That sounded impressive even when no one understood it. But inside Charlemagne's own home, things were a little less polished. The truth is, he had too many children, and not enough patience to pretend otherwise. Sons with titles, daughters with opinions, mistresses with eyebrows raised just slightly too high. The palace in Aachen wasn't just a centre of learning, it was also a very expensive nursery with swords on the walls. Charlemagne loved his children, deeply, loudly. Sometimes unreasonably, he let his daughters stay at court when most kings would have married them off like cattle with better handwriting. He liked having them nearby, listening to music, reading poetry, and turning away suitors with the efficiency of a trained diplomat. It confused the nobles, scandalized a few bishops, but Charlemagne didn't care. He said they were safer under his roof. He never said from what. The sons were another matter, each one named carefully, raised with tutors, and handed little pieces of the empire, like bread crusts at supper. Louis got Aquitaine, Pepin got Italy, Charles got everything else in order. They were raised to be rulers, warriors, and occasionally each other's problems. The emperor watched them with the kind of expression fathers get when they know the inheritance is going to feel more like a sword fight than a ceremony. He tried to plan it out. Who got what? Who answered to whom? There were documents, meetings, heated whispers outside the chapel. But the truth is, no matter how many oaths you swear, the moment a father with a crown starts looking tired, the knives come out, sharpened in the corners of conversations. No one dares record. Charlemagne didn't want division. He wanted continuity, an empire that breathed without him. But families aren't empires. They're messy. They forget things. They argue over horses and titles and who got more apples at breakfast. One son wanted more land. Another wanted more say. One just wanted to be left alone to pray. And in the middle of it all was a father who could defeat the Saxons but couldn't make his sons sit at the same table without glaring. The twist wasn't that he failed. The twist was that he knew he probably would. And he tried anyway. He smiled through meals where no one touched the wine. He prayed a little more complicated. He rewrote the will, again and again just in case. Because Charlemagne could rule churches, armies, foreign kings with delicate egos, but when it came to his own children, the laws got blurry. The parchment got stained. And even the mightiest emperor had to admit, legacy was easier to fight for than to divide. Fighting the Saxons for 30 years street raped, Charlemagne didn't hate the Saxons. Not at first. He probably didn't even know where most of them lived, but once they started burning churches and decapitating tax collectors, the war became personal. It wasn't a quick war, or a clever one. It was a long, slow, muddy kind of war. The kind that starts with a holy banner and ends with everyone wondering who threw the first stone and why they're still bleeding 3 decades later. The Saxons were stubborn. They hid in forests that breathed like beasts and fought like they knew the terrain would always love them more than Charlemagne ever could. Every time he thought it was over, it wasn't. He'd ride home to Aachen thinking peace had finally arrived, only to be greeted with a scroll that said someone named Widukind had risen again and was setting fire to another outpost. Widukind became less of a man and more of a seasonal storm. You didn't defeat him. You just waited for him to quiet down and hoped he would stay that way. The emperor didn't give up. He kept returning, not just with soldiers, but with bishops and builders. He'd conquer a village and leave behind a cross and a tax schedule. He believed in conversion through structure. First, the sword, then the sermon, then the school. It worked sometimes. Other times, the church he built on Tuesday was burned down by Thursday, and the priest barely escaped with his eyebrows. Charlemagne tried everything: bribes, treaties, baptisms, and mass. Once he had an entire river full of Saxons baptized in one day just to check a spiritual box. They came out wet, shivering, and deeply unconvinced. Some converted, some pretended. Some converted again the next time he passed through. The line between faith and fear was thin and muddy. The real twist was how much he cared. He could have razed the land. He could have ignored it, but he didn't. He kept going back and writing laws, sending monks, and dreaming of a unified empire where everyone spoke Latin poorly and prayed on schedule. It wasn't just ambition, it was a belief in order, in peace. In the idea that even a forest full of rebels could one day become part of the story he was trying to write. It took 30 years. That's not an exaggeration. An entire generation of horses lived and died chasing Saxons. And when it was over, when Widukind finally surrendered or just got tired, Charlemagne didn't celebrate. He just exhaled quietly. Like a man who had finally finished a sentence, he started writing in blood. And then he looked east, toward other forests, other borders, other names he couldn't quite pronounce yet, because in an empire this size, peace was never more than a pause. And sometimes that pause sounded suspiciously like hoofbeats in the trees. When the Pope put a crown on his head by the time Charlemagne was done baptizing rivers and bribing bishops, the empire was more or less glued together. It creaked, it leaked, it made strange noises in the night, but it held. And then came the moment that changed everything. Christmas Day, Rome, a heavy robe that smelled like incense and expectations. The Pope looked equal parts holy and nervous, and Charlemagne kneeling in prayer or pretending to, while the whole world waited to see what would happen next. He wasn't born a Roman emperor, he became one, not with a battle, not with a sword, but with a crown that was placed on his head before he had the chance to say no. Or maybe he knew, maybe he planned it, perhaps he didn't. Either way, when Pope Leo III lowered that golden thing onto Charlemagne's huge, astonished head, 1,000 candles flickered, and a title was born. Emperor of the Romans, King of the Franks, Defender of Christendom, the man who could neither write nor whisper without someone writing it down anyway. He stood up slowly. The air felt heavier. The room smelled like wood smoke and political anxiety. He looked around. Nobody breathed. The choir kept singing, because that's what choirs do when they're not sure if they just witnessed history or accidentally started a war. Charlemagne didn't say much. He never did in moments like this. He just nodded once and walked out like a man trying to remember where he left his sword. Back in Aachen, things changed. Not dramatically, just enough. People bowed lower. Letters got longer. Coins got new faces. He was still Charlemagne, the man who hated fancy shoes and overcooked fish. But now he had an empire that wasn't just Frankish. It was Roman, reborn through willpower and wax seals. The twist wasn't that he got the crown. The twist was that he suddenly had to live like he deserved it. Emperors weren't allowed to ignore reports or fall asleep during Mass. They had to listen harder, rule cleaner, send more gifts, write more laws, smile in public, frown with precision. Charlemagne became two people, the man who'd fought 30 years for a forest, and the man who now ruled like the future depended on him getting the Latin just right. He didn't always love it, but he wore it. Quietly, every time someone called him emperor, he blinked a little slower, like he was still getting used to it. He knew the crown wasn't just metal, it was a promise, and it was heavy. He never took it off in public, but sometimes, in the stillness of his chamber, when the candles burned low and the wax ran like tired blood down their sides, he'd set it down. Just for a moment, and look at it like it was still deciding whether it belonged to him or the empire he'd built, trying to deserve it. Aging toothaches and the end of an era even emperors get tired. Not the kind of tired that a bath and a sermon can fix, but the slow, creeping kind that settles in the joints and doesn't leave. Charlemagne didn't announce it. He didn't start limping or coughing dramatically in public. He just began sitting longer and asking fewer questions, staring out windows like he was trying to memorize the weather. The man who had marched through snow, rewritten law, and baptized entire villages, now moved like he was walking through honey. His beard got whiter. His voice got softer. The meals stayed the same, but his appetite left first. He stopped interrupting lessons. He let someone else finish reading the scripture. The pen still stayed near his bedside, though he still couldn't write with it. But he held it anyway, like a reminder that he had tried, that he still remembered how to begin. The aches came slowly, a hip, a shoulder, a cracked tooth that wouldn't stop whispering at night. After that, he just pressed his palm to his jaw and muttered through decisions. Nobody mentioned it, but they started standing closer, repeating things twice, bringing chairs more often than maps. He didn't fear dying. He feared undoing, that all the roads would unpave themselves, that the bishops would bicker and the nobles would start measuring each other's land with sharp sticks. He spent more time in the chapel, not out of desperation but routine. God had always been there, even when the reports from Saxony were late and the beans were cold. Now the prayers felt heavier, not more urgent, just older, like worn fabric that somehow still retains its hold. His sons visited, some more than others. Louis stayed close. The others sent letters that arrived too late or not at all. Charlemagne didn't complain. He just nodded. He still knew their handwriting. He still remembered which one had cried during thunderstorms and which one had stolen a relic just to see what would happen. The last winter hit hard. The wind scratched the palace walls like it had something to say. Charlemagne wrapped himself in more furs. He sat beside the fire and spoke less. On some days he didn't speak at all, just listened as if the empire might whisper back. He gave a few final orders, adjusted some laws, made sure the grain routes were still open, and the misty dominacy had names people feared just enough. And when the time came, quietly without ceremony, he exhaled, like a man who had finally finished a sentence too long to say out loud. The emperor didn't leave behind riches or statues that reached the sky. He left behind an empire that still breathed, not perfectly, not forever, but enough. Enough for someone to pick it up, read the first line, and try to keep going. Charlemagne's legacy, echoes in stone, and soggy manuscripts, the emperor was gone. But the halls of Aachen still whispered, not with ghosts, not precisely, but with echoes, of sandals on stone, of Latin mispronounced with authority, of someone clearing their throat before changing the world, one scroll at a time. Charlemagne didn't leave behind a perfect empire. He left behind a memory, one wrapped in parchment and buried under centuries of dust, but stubborn enough to linger. You could still find pieces of him in old churches where the candlelight flickered a little differently. In school books that still taught grammar, he once misunderstood out loud in crumbling roads that once carried his laws like fragile bones across wild country. The empire he built didn't last forever. Empires never do, but it lasted longer than anyone thought it would, held together by habit, tradition, and the uncomfortable silence that followed when someone said the emperor would not have approved. The monks kept copying, the schools kept teaching. The nobles continued to pretend to understand the laws, even when they skipped entire sections and hoped no one would notice. Coins still bore his face long after his face was dust. And somewhere in a monastery, a scribe still whispered his name, while writing down a rule that might have once passed through his lips. But not all of it survived. Some of the scrolls burned. Some were eaten by time mice, or misplaced by a priest with too many thoughts and not enough shelves. Some of his laws turned into stories. Some of the stories turned into legends, and some of those legends became so intertwined with poetry that even historians started squinting sideways and saying, well, maybe. Charlemagne became something strange, not just a man, not just a myth, but a rhythm, a way of organizing chaos. His crown faded, his name didn't. People argued over what he would have done, as if he might walk back in, frown, and correct them with a shrug and a loaf of bread. The twist isn't that he died. Everyone does. The twist is that he lived loud enough to leave an afterimage, a silhouette burned into history like a candle too close to the wall. And every so often, when someone tried to build something, an idea, a school, a piece, they reached for him. Not because he had all the answers, but because he had once asked the right questions, with enough force to make the continent listen. And maybe that's enough. Not immortality. Just memory, wrapped in wool and sealed in wax. A man who ruled by showing up, who is built by learning, who dreamed bigger than the tools he had, and somehow made it work anyway. So if you ever find yourself in a stone corridor, reading faded Latin by torchlight, and you feel the silence lean in like it's waiting for something, just listen. That's not wind. That's the sound of an empire still trying to finish its sentence. So here we are. The maps have faded. The scrolls are cracked. The Latin has been mispronounced into legend, but the shape of Charlemagne still lingers. Not sharp, not loud, just steady. Like the last note of a hymn echoing through a cold chapel after everyone's gone home. He wasn't perfect. He couldn't spell. He gave his sons too much land and not enough patience. He fought too long in places that forgot him too quickly. But he showed up. He sat in classrooms. He questioned bishops. He fed guests who didn't deserve it and corrected laws he barely had time to enforce. He ruled like a man who knew empires were temporary, but effort wasn't. And that's the lesson buried under the fur cloaks and river baptisms and poorly cooked meat. Not that he was the greatest, but he kept trying. Through toothaches, through muddy roads, through prayers half whispered and names half remembered. So close your eyes now. Let the past settle like dust. Let Aachen grow quiet behind you. The empire can sleep. You've walked through it long enough. And if the wind sounds like footsteps behind you, don't worry. That's just the crown adjusting itself and still waiting for someone to pick it up.